The other day we made a load of delicious elderflower cordial. Well, today we're going to preserve that cordial. We're going to do it using water bath canning. No special pressure canners required, but at the end of it, that cordial will be safe on our shelves at room temperature for at least a couple of years. Hello, welcome to English Country Life. Welcome to the kitchen on a roasting hot day, and welcome to an introduction to water bath canning. Now, in the past we've covered pressure canning in one of our videos, and I'll put a link to it somewhere up here. It's a brilliant technique, and what it does is it uses superheated steam to sterilise and seal the contents of a glass jar. So you can put things like curries and stews and chilies in these jars, heat them, seal them, and they'll last on the shelf for years. Brilliant. But it does involve a quite expensive and for some people quite scary piece of equipment called a pressure canner, like an enormous pressure cooker. Well, today we're going to talk about water bath canning. It's a much more accessible and simple technique, and it substitutes just a big saucepan for that pressure canner. Now, it's not suitable for all kinds of preservation, but it's brilliant for jams and jellies and cordials, which we're going to can today, and even things like preserving your own tomatoes. So a really good technique if you don't want to drop a lot of cash on a pressure canner. It's very straightforward, and I'm going to walk through it step by step. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the book to get if you want to get into this kind of preserving, because it really does cover all the techniques in detail, and it's great to have it to hand. I'm going to cover the jars, the lids, the bands, the things that you seal the food up in. I'm going to explain how they work very clearly. It doesn't take very long, but it's worth understanding. Then we're going to walk through canning up a batch of elderflower cordial that we made the other day, so you can see the technique from start to finish. It's clean, it's easy, it's straightforward. Let's get going. If you're going to get into canning, or bottling as it used to be called in the UK, I strongly recommend getting a copy of this book, The Ball's Complete Book of Home Preserving. It advertises itself as having 400 recipes in it, but I think what's more important than that is the step-by-step instructions that you can find in the back of the book. And they literally list all the equipment you need, how it goes together, big saucepan here, and you notice there's a bit of a wire rack on the bottom, and the type of jars. And it then goes through literally how much water you've got to put into the thing, different techniques for putting on the lids and bands, how to measure it using funnels, how to lift the lids up. All the kind of things that I'm going to show you today are covered in detail in writing with very good diagrams in this book. And I think if you're going to preserve food, you want to do it safely, you want to do it well, you don't want spoilage. It's well worth the investment. We'll put a link in the description below where you can find that book on our Amazon shop. Honestly, really is one of our top buys. So step one, get a proper canning guide, follow the instructions and follow the recipes, because they do vary from material to material and you need to process them in the right way. Step two, get proper canning jars, also known as mason jars. They look like this, although they come in various sizes. The lid is kind of what makes them special. The single-use disposable lids are flat. They sit on top, and then you get one of these, like a hollow ring known as a band, that secures it in place while you're doing the processing and cooking. Let me bring you in close and show you the features of that, because it's quite important you understand how they work. It won't take long. Then we'll get on with a step-by-step guide to actually how we can our cordial. So let me quickly run you over the mason jar system. These are the jars themselves. Big, thick, glass-walled jars with, as you can see, quite a coarse thread at the top of the jar. This is almost the magic of the system. This is what makes it work. This is the lid. These are generally single-use items, although reusable ones are becoming available now. It's a metal lid, plastic lines so that if you can anything that's a bit acid, it doesn't dissolve. And the orange band you can see here is a thermal setting glue. Now that lid just sits on the top like that. It doesn't hold itself in place as it is. So to hold it in place during the canning process, you use one of these. That's called a band, and it goes over the lid and you just finger tighten it gently. Then you go through the canning process, and during the canning process what happens is the contents that you've put in will be heated up, they'll give off steam, the steam will find its way out of the unsealed lid The contents are pasteurised and the jar is sterilised. After a set period of time, you remove it from the heat, and as it cools down, the steam that was in the neck of the jar will condense, causing a partial vacuum, sucking this lid closed, and the thermal setting glue round the edge that melted during the canning process, or became soft and sticky during the canning process, will set hard again, sealing that jar closed. And what you've then got is pasteurised contents in a sterilised jar in a very neat package. It's a great technique, it works really, really well. So let's walk through it step by step. Okay, here's my water bath canning setup. Chuffing great stock pan or catering pan, and that is full of jars that are full of hot water. The whole thing full of water, and the jars are preheated. In this pan I've got my cordial, and that again is preheated, and in this pan I've got my lids, and they're just in hot but not boiling water for 10 minutes to soften that glue that we talked about. The process: take a hot jar out of the water, empty the water, fill it with hot cordial. You don't want to put hot cordial in a cold jar because the jar will shatter. Pop on a lid and then a band. Return the jar to the canner, which is just a fancy term for the big saucepan. When all the jars are full, we'll boil it for 15 minutes, and that will pasteurise the content and soften the glue. We'll remove then the jars from the hot water, let them cool. They will seal themselves with their pasteurised content, pop a label on, and we're done. So let's go through that one step at a time. Here's our big saucepan then. We can call it a canner if we want, a water bath canner, but really it's just a big saucepan. It's a big old catering pan that we use for all sorts of things. Now, in it are the jars preheating, as we discussed earlier. I've got those jars in a canning rack here. I'm using gloves because I don't want to dip my fingers in boiling water. But what that is a convenient wire rack that the jars sit in, and you can lift them out of the boiling water for emptying and refilling purposes. But you don't need one. If you haven't got one and you've got a wire cake rack or a trivet or even an old tea towel, just put that in the bottom to stop the jars directly touching the metal and you'll be fine. First thing we need is an empty hot jar. So we pick one up with tongs, we empty the water out, and that is now ready for filling with our hot contents. So here's our hot cordial, and we're going to ladle that into the jars using a jam funnel. So my next job is to fill this jar to within ½ inch of the rim, and I struggle to know what that is. And someone told me about these. These are brilliant. These are sort of canning measures, and each notch, so that notch shows me 1/4 inch depth as soon as it touches the liquid. ½ inch, 3/4 inch, 1 inch. You can get them on Amazon and I think they're brilliant. To be honest, again, you could just do it with a plastic ruler. That would be absolutely fine. So next we use a wide mouth canning or jam funnel. We put it on top of the jar. We ladle in our contents within ½ inch of the rim. So here's our jar fresh out of the boiling water. Here is our jam funnel. What we're going to do is fill the jar with our hot cordial. I'm going to fill it, as I said, to within ½ inch of the rim of the jar. And if I'm in any doubt, I can use the handy dandy gauge to check my fill level. Now, before I put the lid on, there's something that's really important to do, and that is to wipe the neck of the jar. Because if I've got any syrup on the neck of that jar, it will prevent the lid from sealing properly. So 2 seconds just to make sure you're not wasting your time and effort. Using a pair of tongs, I take a lid out of the hot but not boiling water and centralise it on the jar. And then with the lid centralised, I will put on one of the bands and I'm only tightening it down till it meets resistance, just kind of finger tight, not screwing it down hard. If you screw it down hard, the steam can't get out and the lid will buckle. Now, another little device that's helpful but not necessary is a jar lifter. So I can pick that up and put it back in the hot water. I've managed to fill 6 jars with 3 litres of the elderflower cordial. What I've done now, turn the gas on to high, put the lid on, I'm going to bring it up to a rolling boil. When it hits that rolling boil, I'm going to keep it there for 15 minutes. If you ever seen a recipe somewhere where it says process the jars for 15 minutes, that means when you're water bath canning, you start the clock once you've hit a rolling boil. So we're at full rolling boil, we'll keep it boiling, i.e. processing the jars for 15 minutes. So at 15 minutes, the water's still boiling, we'll turn off the heat and we'll leave it just for 5 minutes so that the content of the jars can stop boiling violently. So that's the processing part of the technique completed. They've had 15 minutes of a rolling boil and 5 minutes just to cool a little so the contents of the jar aren't violently boiling. Let's take them out of the canner, let them cool down so that that lid can suck down as the vacuum forms and the glue can seal to the rim of the jar. So there's our jars. And this is our can lifter, and it clips neatly around the neck of the jar, allowing us to remove it from the canner without scalding our hands. And we'll put the jars on a wooden board. Some people put them on a tea towel, but you don't want to mark up your work surfaces with very hot jars. Did you hear those clicks? Those clicks are the lid sucking down onto the rim of the jar. It's a great sound. You'd often hear people talk about pinging on jars, but actually for me it is more of a click as the lid seals down. One thing I like to do wearing oven gloves is just tighten those bands down whilst the jar's cool. I'm not sure it's really necessary, but it always reassures me to think that the lid is being held firmly in place as the jar cools. This is worth looking at. You can probably see it looks like that jar's almost dusty. That's because the water around here is really hard, really chalky. And when you boil the jars in water, they pick up the dissolved calcium carbonate from the water. It isn't a problem, it's only on the outside of the jar, but it can be a little bit unsightly, particularly if you want to give them as a gift. One way to get rid of that is just to take a clean cloth, put a little bit of vinegar on it and wipe the jar over, but only do that once it's cooled. That's pretty much it for the processing side. They've had their time in the boiling water, we let them cool for 5 minutes, taken them out, screwed the bands down. I'll then usually leave them overnight, but you want to leave them until they're thoroughly cool. The next part from there, we take the bands off. You don't leave them on when the jars are in storage. Check the seal on every lid. We need to make sure that it's sucked in properly, that you can't click it with your finger. Wipe them off with vinegar if you've got hard water. Put a label on it. And with the label, I'll always put not just the contents, but when I canned them, so I know that they're still in date when I come to use them. The jars have cooled overnight, so our job's today then, take the bands off, check the seal, make sure they've sealed properly, clean off any of that chalky stuff from the hard water and label the jars. Here's the jar. First job, just remove the band. We don't store them with the band on, it doesn't serve any purpose and it can just go rusty. The next thing is I'm pressing hard on this lid. If the lid has sealed properly, it's been sucked down and there's no give in the lid, it's rock solid. If it clicks or moves, the jar hasn't sealed properly, it either needs to be reprocessed or put in the fridge and used up quickly. This is the next operation, clear all this chalky stuff off the glass jar. It doesn't matter, it's not harmful, but I don't think it looks very nice. In this bowl, I've got a bit of our own cider vinegar. And the acid in vinegar dissolves up that chalk very quickly. So all I'm going to do is just wipe the jar down. Any ordinary vinegar will do, whatever you've got in the house, and it'll get rid of that chalky deposit on the glass. Then we'll just let that dry. When all that's done, I dry the lids just to make sure there's none of that acid left sat on the metal lid. Just give the jar a little bit of a polish. Recently I've come to really like these oil-based pens for writing on glass. My daughter showed me the chalk pens and they were good, but for stuff you're going to store for a while, they tend to rub off if you touch the jars a lot, moving them around, etc. Whereas these oil ones, they will stay on there until you clean the writing off with a scouring pad. Really like them, very useful. The alternative, of course, you can just write on the lid, given the lids are single use, with a Sharpie. That's our introduction to water bath canning. It's a simple technique, it really is. Although I would advise, as I said, get in the book if you're going to get into it, because it's one of those things you tend to do at certain times of year and then not do it again for a good long while. And having the book there with the recipes, with the advice, with the guidance on the techniques is always a good thing when you pick it up again after several months. If you've enjoyed today's content, can you spare us 5 seconds? Give us a thumbs up down below. Now, we are thinking of showing water bath canning of tomatoes, because that's something we've been asked about quite a lot. A lot of gardeners, allotmenteers, smallholders end up with gluts. And tomatoes is one of those things you can water bath can to preserve your excess. If you'd like to see that or any other preserving videos, let us know in the comments. Let us know what you want to know about and we'll try and cover it in future videos. And if you want to see those videos, whack on the subscribe button and the bell next to it. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, you'll hear every time we upload a new video. But whatever you do, come back and see us soon. Take care.